Chapter 8 of Alexander the Great by Ada Russell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Conquest of Persia, 331 through 330 BC. In June or July of 331 BC, after an 11 days' march, Alexander arrived at Thapsacus on the Euphrates. Darius had assembled an army half as large again as his former vast force. Wild Bactrians, Scythians, Indians, Syrians, Cappadocians, and other faraway peoples had flocked across mountain, desert, and river to Babylon at the summons of the great king, and 1,000,000 foot soldiers and 40,000 horse soldiers filled the plain of Mesopotamia. When he heard of Alexander's approach, Darius sent the brave Masius to prevent him from crossing the Euphrates, and to ravage the country so that the Macedonians could not proceed by the direct route to Babylon, a way it was also improbable that they would take on account of the heat. He himself passed with his army over the Tigris and sought for a favorable battlefield. This he found at Gaugamela, a village on the river Eumotus, now the Gazir, near the city of Arbela, Erbel, famous in history as the place where he and Alexander fought their last fight for the possession of Asia. The battle, 1st of October 331 BC, is often called Arbela, but more correctly Gaugamela. The scene was a vast plain, unbroken by tree or ravine, and Darius, remembering Issus, leveled to the ground any slight eminences. Alexander had sent a force to make a bridge over the Euphrates. It was not quite completed on account of Masius' presence on the other side, but at the appearance of Alexander, Masius and his 3,000 cavalry fled. Alexander passed over, and after a few days' rest, hastened across Mesopotamia, reduced by Masius to a wilderness of fire and ashes, to the Tigris, Dijla, the great river of the east, known to the Hebrews and Persians as the Arrow, on account of its swiftness. Nineveh, long in ruins, stood on its banks, and centuries later Baghdad was to rise lower down the stream. There was no one to resist the Macedonians crossing, but they had great difficulty in finding a ford, and then the water was so deep as to reach to the horses' heads, and the current so strong that horse and rider were nearly swept away, while their packages were whirled down the stream. It was a hard moment for the men when they saw their cherished booty diminishing on the racing river, and disappearing in its waters. Alexander led the infantry at this critical moment, and motioned in a manner that there was no disobeying for them to hold their armor above their heads, and let all else go, pointing out the route with his hand, and his voice could not carry over the whole force. Menelaus of the loud war cry would have been useful at this crisis. Had Darius appeared, one wonders what had become of the Macedonian army. The soldiers seemed to have felt very dismal after their crossing, and as an eclipse of the moon followed, 20th September 331 BC, they were entirely disheartened. Alexander, to cheer them, offered sacrifices to the sun, the moon, and to the earth, whose doing it was, and the omens in the sacrifices were declared to be most propitious. The real cause of the eclipse was known to the king, who had carried away some Egyptian astrologers, the astronomers of his time, in his train, but he did not attempt to explain the phenomenon to the crowd, who would probably have thought the explanation impious. The army then turned south toward Babylon, with the Tigris on the right-hand side. As it proceeded toward the plain of Gaugamela, the wife of Darius, a delicately bred woman, little fitted for these hard journeys, died, and the sorrow of the conqueror and the splendid funeral he gave her can hardly have been of much comfort to old Sisygambis and the high-spirited Persian children who were now eating the bitter bread of captivity. A eunuch escaped to make the heart of Darius still heavier by telling him the news. A panic, of which the cause has never been discovered, seized the Macedonian army at this point, and Alexander was forced to give the soldiers time for rest, and exercise all his wits to restore their courage. At last he succeeded, and the camp was broken up. Masius, who watched them from a neighboring height, fled at their approach to warn Darius, and the Macedonians, occupying the summit he had left, looked eagerly out to see the Persian army congregated in the plain below. A thick mist at first hid the immense multitude, but its noise filled their ears, and even the royal heart of Alexander misgave him. Then the mist cleared, and the myriads of the enemy came clearly into view, and miraculously enough, as the soldiers of the Iliad would have thought, Ares himself, bane of mortals, filled every Macedonian heart with longing for battle. The Macedonians gave great shouts, which the Persian host returned, until the distant forests and mountains re-echoed with horrible war cries, the neighing of battle steeds and the clanging of armor. At this crisis of his life, Alexander appears to have hesitated for the first time as to his course of action. He expressed himself as doubtful in the council of generals, and took Parmenio's advice as to reconnoitering the ground, to see if the enemy had laid any traps. Parmenio said boldly that a fight by daylight was out of the question. The soldiers must not be terrified by the view of the numbers of the enemy. They had faced the great king at Issus, but the great king could not deploy his forces in a mountain defile. Here he could surround the Macedonians at his ease. The Macedonians must take him by surprise at night. Nearly all the generals applauded, but the king replied with what seemed childish folly to these old men who did not yet know his depth. He had probably learned through his excellent intelligence department that Darius expected a night attack, and that morning would find him weary with watching. Secondly, a night attack was a risky thing. Who knew what panic might not fall on his own troops, fighting the strange tribes of the east by the wild light of the campfires, and in a district which the enemy knew far better than they. Lastly, the moral effect of a victory in the light of day would be infinitely greater than that of a stolen victory. It was with all his weight behind his words that Alexander answered in the grand manner, "I steal no victory." The generals shrugged their shoulders, but the king's laconism roused a better fighting spirit than any amount of unfolding of policy would have done. Thus, while the Persian army kept vigil in the plain, shining afar with lights and fires, Darius and his officers going from watch to watch to see that all was well, and invoking the aid of Ormuzd, the Macedonian soldiers were ordered to repose. Aristander and the king sacrificed to Zeus, Athena, and victory, and Alexander was some time before he could compose his mind to slumber, but he finally sank into a profound sleep. His generals came at sunrise to receive their orders, and were surprised to find sleeping him who generally roused the camp. They even suspected that he desired to avoid the combat, and depression fell on all. At last Parmenio was forced to wake him, and even reproached his master. Alexander, however, rose fresh as the morn. He explained his deep sleep by his freedom from care now that he had no longer to chase Darius. Calling for his cuirass, which he only bore in important engagements, he soon appeared at the head of his army, and never had his face so shone with gaiety. The scythed chariot seemed from a distance to be the most formidable part of the great king's preparations, and Alexander prescribed similar tactics to those employed against the barbarians' wagons 4 years before in the ship Capas. When the chariots, drawn by swift war steeds, wheeled in among their ranks, the soldiers were to open if possible, and let them pass through. If not possible, they were to frighten the horses by their cries, and stop their advance with flights of arrows. The Indians had furnished Darius with about 15 elephants, now first heard of in the history of warfare. Not only were these mighty beasts formidable combatants, but their smell caused such terror to horses that they were much used against cavalry. The Macedonian line was extended to the utmost, so as to prevent outflanking, and a special force was placed in the rear to guard against that great danger. Alexander's army numbered about 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. As usual, he commanded the right wing, where were the cavalry companions under Clytus. Parmenio the left, with the cavalry of the Thessalians and Greek allies, while the phalanx was in the center, with the archers on the wings and in the second array in the rear. Darius sat on a raised seat in his chariot in the center of the army, according to the Persian custom. Round him were his kinsmen and the Persian guards, carrying spears with golden apples at the butt end, Indians, Albanians, Carians, and Martian archers. Beyond them stretched Eusians, Babylonians, Citizanians, Armenians, Cappadocians, and Greek mercenaries, the Greeks this time stationed in the van, in 2 divisions, one on each side of Darius and the Persian contingent. For once Alexander had no stream to cross before the enemy's eyes. After his inspection of the force opposite him, he moved to the right, and the Persians followed, moving to their left. The king continued this maneuver until Darius had been nearly drawn away from his prepared battlefield, and advanced cavalry to prevent Alexander moving farther. A general cavalry engagement followed, in which the Macedonians suffered severely from the Scythians, but at last broke the enemy's line. Meanwhile the chariots had been directed against the phalanx, and for a while their size mowed down and mutilated the Macedonians. The Macedonians in some cases seized the horses, while their archers directed fatal showers of missiles against steeds and charioteers, but also succeeded, as they had been ordered, in opening their ranks and letting these eastern engines of war roll through, to be thereupon overpowered in the rear. The much-feared Persian chariot did a negligible amount of damage. Parmenio, with characteristic fussiness, sent to inform Alexander that his baggage was in danger, and Alexander impatiently replied, "Tell Parmenio that if we conquer we shall recover our possessions, and seize the enemies. No one must be taken from the battle for this purpose, and bid him forget such unworthy things and fight as becomes so distinguished a Macedonian soldier." The Persians, therefore, were left with a free hand at the baggage, slew the guards, and set the prisoners free. They found Sisygambus, to whom they announced the joyful news that Darius had won a great victory. They failed, however, to deceive the old woman, or in any way to rouse her. She listened in silence with immobile countenance, and refused to leave the Macedonian camp. Perhaps some instinct of the horrible fate awaiting the last of the royal house of the Achaemenids may have possessed her. When Alexander had at last made a break in the front line of the Persians, he formed a wedge of the companion cavalry and the bristling phalanx, and led it into the gap. The charioteer of Darius was slain, and the battle became a carnage. Alexander had tired out several horses, and was fighting like Heracles, smiting down those who resisted him and those who turned their backs to fly. Darius himself fled with the first, this time in clear cowardice, as he left the way to Babylon open to the invader. The great majority of his host followed him, hidden in the cloud of dust they raised. By the shouting and cracking of whips alone could the Macedonians tell which way the great king's guard had passed. A far more pitiable fate awaited Darius than death upon the field. Parmenio vexed Alexander again by sending for aid just when the king was anxious to follow after Darius, for much would have been spared the army if this had been the end of the chase. Masius, on the Persian right wing, had been threatening the Thessalian cavalry with destruction, but lost hope and fell back when he saw the flight of Darius. The spirits of the Thessalian cavalry revived, and they were eager to pursue, but Parmenio restrained them, and Masius escaped with a few of his men to Babylon. Alexander appeared in time to slay the greater number in the hottest engagement of the day. While Parmenio took possession of the Persian camp, Alexander advanced to the river Lycus, now the great Zab, a tributary of the Tigris, threw the multitude of the dead and the wounded abandoned in the flight. The losses of Darius were estimated at 300,000. After allowing his men to rest until midnight, Alexander made a forced march to Arbela, 69 miles from the battlefield, and here, though he captured the treasure of Darius with his chariot, spear, and bow, he did not succeed in finding the great king. The Macedonians were soon driven away from this neighborhood by the smell from the battlefield, where vultures and dogs were disposing of the Persian dead. Darius fled neither to Babylon nor Susa, but northward through the mountains to Armenia, to Media, there hoping to gather a fresh force. He meditated, in the philosophical way of a Persian, that wealth and prosperity had a corrupting effect on human character, and accepted his lot with a characteristic resignation of the East. Alexander did not follow. The way to Babylon was open, and thither he and his army eagerly advanced. Masius, his son, and other magnates came forth to surrender it, and Alexander peacefully entered into the city of Semiramis, Bel, and Nebuchadnezzar. The Babylonians even decked his way with flowers and garlands, and made rich gifts, and Alexander here also was able to take up the position of liberator from the alien Persian. There is nothing to show that the yoke of Persia had been particularly hard upon her subject peoples, The tribute she levied was not heavy, and life was so good in Babylon, for instance, that the Jews were unwilling to return to their country when Cyrus ended the captivity. Yet Persia was hated, and the chief reason for this, besides the natural love of freedom, was that Persia had never been polite to native deities. Alexander never erred in this way. He commanded the temples destroyed by Xerxes in Babylon to be rebuilt, and paid his respects to Bel, the Baal of Scripture, spending an enormous amount in the restoration of his temple, for which the labor of 10,000 workmen was required. He also appointed the Persian Mazius as a reward for his submission, satrap of Babylonia. In Babylon, Alexander kept up royal state. He and his army were amazed at this immense city with its palaces and its 100 gates. Before the Persian conquest, the wall, one of the 7 wonders of the world, had enclosed an area 4 times the extent of London, and was 300 feet high, with lofty towers rising still higher all around its circumference, and we are told 28 yards wide. This wall had gone, apparently pulled down by the Persian conquerors, but there still remained the inner wall, itself of remarkable loftiness, and of such width that on the top, among the towers which rose all around it, the picturesque quadrigae of the ancients could pass each other. The swift Euphrates ran between pleasant embankments through the city, the 2 parts of which were united by a bridge, accounted a miracle of engineering skill. And above the river, round an ancient palace, rose the famous hanging gardens of Semiramis. In this city, adorned by the old Babylonian kings with so many marvels, the Macedonian soldiers who had conquered all Asia rested from their labors and took their pleasure, the fearful inhabitants eager to gratify their least whim, and Alexander anxious to let them see that so much fighting and weariness was worth while. 5 weeks were spent in this way while he was waiting for the arrival of fresh troops. Then he made a 20 days' march to the capital, Susa, the Shushan of the Book of Esther, on the river Coaspes, a stream famous for its sweet water. Here he found the principal Persian treasure house, containing 50,000 talents, a sum equivalent to from $50 to $100 million. Objects brought from Greece by Xerxes came into his possession, and he sat at last upon the throne of Darius, a proud moment for Greeks if they could have accepted Alexander's work. It was a bitter moment for loyal Persians, and for the captive queen mother and royal children. Alexander, seeing them droop more and more each day, recommended weaving as a distraction to Sisygambis and the princesses, as he remembered how much it occupied his mother and female relatives at home. But their tears fell thick and fast at this insult to their noble birth, and he had great difficulty in assuring them of the kindness of his intention. He could not consider himself free to follow Darius until he had visited the old center of Persian power, Persepolis, the town built by Cyrus. He had to fight his way into Persia proper, for the passes which led from the plain of Mesopotamia into the highlands of Persia were held by the warlike Ushians, who would not let the great king himself pass without payment. They hurled down missiles on the conqueror's army, and after he had chased them away he had to face Ariobarzanes, the royal satrap of Persis, at the head of 40,000 infantry and 700 cavalry in the Persian gates. Ariobarzanes had entrenched his men behind a wall which he had caused to be built across the pass, and awaited Alexander as the Thessalians had awaited him at Tempe 6 years before. Now as then, Alexander circumvented the enemy. A Lycian prisoner, who had been a shepherd in these parts, led part of the army in the night by a forest track known only to the herdsmen, while Craterus remained with the rest of the army to deceive the enemy. It was a rough, precipitous track, snow fell, and a bitter wind stung the Macedonians, who began at length to doubt the Lycians' purpose. And it was after memorable hardships that when morning dawned, the little army burst forth on the enemy at the head of the pass and took it unawares. Craters swarmed up from the plain, and a terrible carnage took place on both sides. The king, in this January of 330 B.C., received news that Persepolis was to be pillaged. To prevent its wealth falling into Macedonian hands, and leaving his infantry, he dashed forward with his cavalry, marched all night, and arrived at the Araxes at daybreak. By the destruction of several hamlets, the materials were obtained for a bridge, and Alexander hastened on. As he approached Persepolis, a large body of captive Greeks was allowed to come out to meet him, and they were a sight to inspire terrible revenge in their fellow countrymen's breasts. They were mutilated in the most horrible way, no longer possessing human faces, and nearly all refused Alexander's offer to send them back to Greece, where they knew they could only shock their old friends. They at least saw in Alexander an avenger sent by Zeus, and the king did all he could to make them happy in this outlying part of his empire. On the day following, Alexander entered the city from which the troops of Darius the Great and Xerxes had set forth to conquer Greece, and it was found to surpass even Babylon and Susa in the treasure it contained. Camels, it is said, had to be fetched from those places to carry away all the wealth, 120,000 talents, in the public treasury. Stories now utterly discredited tell us that for a while the king allowed free massacre and pillage, but Persepolis had made no opposition to him, and even as he had to be severe where a city was held against him, so it would have been fatal to his career of conquest if he had slaughtered those who surrendered. The Macedonians feasted and revelled in Persepolis as in Babylon, and Dryden has described the great revel and bonfire with which their visit closed. At Alexander's feast, the young king and his war-worn officers lay listening with varying emotions to the musician Timotheus. War, he sang, is toil and trouble, honor but an empty bubble, never-ending, still beginning, fighting still and still destroying. If the world be worth thy winning, think, oh think, if worth enjoying. Lovely Thais sits beside thee, take the gifts the gods provide thee. Whatever the actual temper of the Macedonian army, never has the mood of soldiery in an hour of relaxation been better caught than by Dryden. The poet continues, much on the lines of the legend, that at last the mighty master smote the chord of vengeance. The king, stirred to madness, rose and grasped a flambeau. Thais with a torch led the way, and the palace of the kings of Persia, built of cedar wood, was soon flaring in the night sky. Others believe that this was no outrage of the wine-cup, but a calculated and impressive act. The Persian invasions had been the deed of the great kings, not of their subjects, and Alexander emphasized this fact by the symbol he chose for destruction. He took no vengeance on Asia, now his own kingdom. Somewhat sobered by their outburst of frenzy, the Macedonians went on their way. Their king was now the great king, and it only remained to find his dispossessed rival. They sought him at Ecbatana, the capital of Media, where he had been residing since Gaugamela. But he had fled northward to the Caspian Gates, meaning to lay waste Parthia and Hyrcania and hide in Bactria. Alexander stayed some time in Ecbatana, which was the summer residence of the Persian kings. Its palace was adorned with capitals and entablatures of gold and silver, and with silver tiles and wainscotings, and the city, with its strong citadel and 7 walls, seemed to him a fitting place to make his treasury. Here he left the Persian hoard, amounting to nearly £500,000,000 of English money in value, in charge of his childhood's friend Harpalus, who was to prove too weak for such a gigantic trust. The king sent home from Ecbatana all the soldiers of the Greek allies who wished to leave him, but retained, with or without its will, his own national levy. The dismissal of the allies made no constitutional difference to his presidency over Hellas. Parmenio was left with a large portion of the army to attend to various affairs in Media, and then marched through Cappadocia to Hyrcania, while Alexander and his force pushed on after Darius. He made such speed that horses and men fell by the way, and on the 11th day he arrived at Rake, near Taran, a day's march from the Caspian Gates, only to find that Darius had passed through. After 5 days' rest, Alexander left Media, now a part of his empire, and marched by the Caspian Gates into Parthia, a state of little importance in his time. As news arrived that the Persian nobles under Bessus, satrap of the rich province of Bactria, had revolted against Darius and put him in chains, he pressed forward at a still more mad rate. Taking with him only the companions and a few picked infantry, marching the whole night until noon the next day, and the whole of the second night, until he found a cold campfire, where he had expected to find the Persians. He learned that the Greek mercenaries and a few Persians had remained faithful to Darius, but powerless to protect him from Bessus, had left him. Despite the most fearful fatigue, Alexander hastened on, riding all night and until noon next day, when he came to Thara, the Parthian village where Bessus had encamped the day before. He learned that the enemy also was fleeing night and day, and determined to try a short cut through the desert, leaving the infantry to follow by the route Bessus had taken. Before daybreak he came upon the Persians, unarmed and defenseless. Stabbing the hapless Darius, whom they were conveying in a covered carriage, Bessus and his companions left him and fled, and the train of pursuers passed by. His horses dragged the great king away from the roadside, and, deserted by every friend and servant, he died. There was a story of a courteous, dying message to Alexander delivered to the Greeks who found him. Alexander, when he came up, threw a cloak and pity over the body of his king, robbed of his purple robe and lying dead in the dust in a condition sad enough for a beggar. Like Croesus, Darius had experienced the utmost from the mutability of fortune, and like Cyrus, Alexander showed respect to fallen greatness, rendering every honor to his dead rival's corpse. End of Chapter 8.